This is a small fishing boat, and that's Mang Anal, a Filipino fisherman on the boat taking on two Chinese Coast Guard boats. Later, he circled around the huge Chinese Coast Guard vessel in an apparent show of protest right after the chase, his mother boat joining in and sailing close to the foreign vessel. They're a group of fishermen caught in a standoff between China's naval frigate turned Coast Guard ship 3105 and a much smaller Filipino Coast Guard vessel, the Datu Bangkao. What China's boats are doing here is illegal, but they've not had enough resistance to stop them. But now it's changing. The Philippines vowed on Tuesday not to back down in the face of a Chinese effort to block its fishermen from accessing a nearby island. The comments came a day after Manila cut a floating 300-meter, or about 980 feet barrier installed by Beijing at the shoal. And China disguises coast guards as fishermen and together, with their bigger vessels, bully and block off the Philippines from accessing the area. And that's been the reality of the South China Sea. Southeastern countries have to deal with China's bullying and its illegal claims from the Chinese Communist Party. That's known as the Nine Dash Lines in the area. It's happening all around the islands near the Philippines, like the Second Thomas Shoal near the Spratly Islands and the Scarborough Shoal near Manila. And in particular, the Scarborough Shoal, where this recent confrontation happened, is ruled by the United Nations Convention of the Law of the Sea as belonging to the Philippines' economic exclusion zone, and that's about 200 nautical miles from its land. Now, back in 2012, Beijing seized control of it and forced Filipino fishermen to travel further for smaller catches. But now the Philippines is fighting back. Yesterday, under the orders of President Bongbong Marcos Jr., the Filipino Coast Guards dived into the water to cut China's illegal floating barriers, ropes that ward off the area from the surrounding, and that is, again, in the Scarborough Shoal. Now, after the barriers were cut, China silently removed the rest. There wasn't a violent confrontation this time. Simply, I think that the CCP knows that they're in the wrong, and they have no jurisdiction here. Islands in the South China Sea have long been claimed by the CCP as Chinese territory, and they've set up shop here under illegal sovereignty. The Chinese regime, banking on little to no resistance, slowly built up man-made sand islands in some of them. Now, these illegal claims violate other countries' sovereignty, and this has greatly affected the Filipino fishing industry. Meanwhile, China voiced its opposition to cutting the barrier, saying that we urge the Philippines not to make provocation or seek trouble. And that's the China's Foreign Ministry spokesperson, Wang Wenbing. But this is a turning point. No longer will the Filipino government sit around and watch the Chinese Coast Guard bully them. And our man, Man Anyal, is a symbol of that resistance. China's response to the Philippines is calling them a vassal of the United States. It's an attempt to make it seem like the US is the bully here, and that's simply not true. The Philippines is right to receive support from the United States and other countries around the South China Sea as well. Otherwise, how would they go about against the bullying from the CCP, who clearly has a much bigger Coast Guard force? And here is the CCP state media, the Global Times, using offensive remarks saying, quote, such hype does not fit the national interest of the Philippines, but that of the US. Look, it's an attempt to ward off the embarrassment of Manila one-upping it by dismantling the barrier. Such lines from China, really, they undermine the Philippines' own interest in fishing and keeping the economic exclusion zone of the nation sovereign. It's an offensive term to the southeastern country in its own right. I mean, why can't a country protect its own interests? Isn't it always them, the CCP, doing it too? And why does it seem like every time they try to protect themselves, it's for the benefit of the United States? It's not. It's about the national sovereignty. Isn't the CCP always the one that stresses national sovereignty here, sovereignty there, sovereignty everywhere? So why is it different when other countries, like the Philippines, want to do it too? Now, Beijing scrambles for a public response to collect its lost face, but it's too late. The actions of the Filipino Coast Guard just opened up a new territory in the fight against China's illegal claims. Confrontations have been getting more and more frequent between China and the Philippines, but it's also showing that the side of the will of the Filipinos to fight back and to defend their own interest. Now, more countries can begin to challenge the CCP in their own sovereignty claims. For example, Vietnam has opposed China for installing ship automatic identification stations in the Paracel Islands, which sits closer to Vietnam, calling it a violation of sovereignty. The Paracel has long been an issue between Vietnam and China, and it may be our next focus too. Now, you may be thinking that this is the United States playing politics here, but it's far from that. The bottom line here is to protect and prevent the Chinese Communist Party from encroaching on the rights of other countries. And just because there's no physical borders or barriers, and just because it's in the middle of the ocean, doesn't mean that laws don't apply. In the middle of the ocean, the CCP would draw these man-made lines using ropes and floating barriers. Not only do they stop fishing, they actually are troublesome to submarines and other vessels too. The Chinese regime, what they're doing here is claiming the islands, begin to police the surrounding areas of the ocean with its Navy-converted Coast Guard vessels. This has led to a recent confrontation between the Philippines and China. In one instance, the Chinese Coast Guards used water cannon to attack the Filipino Coast Guard. And just 2 weeks ago, the Chinese Coast Guard boats, much larger in size, attempted a dangerous maneuver. Footage from the Philippines Coast Guard shows that Chinese Coast Guard boats, and what they're doing here is they're harassing and they're trying to block the Filipinos from a resupply mission to the BRP Sierra Madre. And that happened on September 8th. The Philippines completed the resupply mission despite China's harassment. The BRP Madre, by the way, is a ship on shore, and it's serving as an outpost on the second Thomas Shoal. And just to show you that it's constantly facing China's aggression. And following the last 2 days incident, the response on Chinese social media and searches on different websites for the particular incident have skyrocketed. And this actually is higher than other events like the Asia Game, which is going on in Hangzhou. This has essentially impacted the long-term preaching that the CCP has, which is it's going to protect its own sovereignty. But in this particular case, they did nothing. They had no grounds to do anything, except voiced a few words. Are they all talks and no action? Well, they simply can't do anything because this is a public space. It's one protected by the law of the sea. And they've only been able to bully countries in the past, like the Philippines, because the US hasn't been able to provide enough attention to the South China Sea. So it's a long-term issue that deserved a lot of attention. And the US now has promised to invoke mutual defense with the Philippines should China threaten them again. And this provides insurance for the Filipinos to protect their own fishing zones. In the past, countries like the Philippines have been much closer to China in terms of trade and other economic incentives that could have made up for the loss with fishing, but nowadays it's different. The Philippines have effectively moved to secure its own interest by moving away from China, and by being with an international partner instead of an international bully, and that's the way forward. Now, I say this because this is all the CCP's own doing. Last month, the CCP published a new map that further intruded on the sovereignty by adding one additional dashed line near Taiwan. It effectively rendered the sovereignty of the Philippines useless in the region south of Taiwan. And this so-called new 10-dash line effectively tries to claim 90% of the South China Sea as its own. And that crosses the international standard by the law of the sea, which outlines from the border to the 200 nautical mile distance from each country's land border is where that they can actually maintain sovereignty. All outside of that is either international water or it belongs to another country. That alone places the CCP's claim as illegal. And such an attempt angered the countries around the South China Sea, including Taiwan and the Philippines. Simply because the CCP operates illegally all the time, they've never been able to be repelled by the smaller countries around the South China Sea. And that's again because of China's military size. So by the US backing countries now on these particular issues, it gives them a lot of leverage to actually do something about it. They actually, of course, the historical facts, right? It goes back all the way to the earlier days of the CCP, the 1950s and 1960s. So it's been ongoing for a while. But it really rapidly accelerated in terms of the attention in 2013 when Xi Jinping came into power. They began filling the islands with rocks and sand, putting actual military facilities on them. And so the US sat back even through the Obama, Trump, and now earlier years of the Biden administration, not doing much about it. Finally, the issue now is being put on the table because the CCP is closer to invading Taiwan. But the situation has changed. Not only has China's aggression increased, but the nearby countries have also received clear support from the United States to protect their own sovereignty. So China's attempts are often passively accepted in the past, but now they can't anymore, right? There's no more economic incentives that China can provide that's much better than what the United States is doing for countries like Vietnam or the Philippines. And while the CCP has been weaponizing the South China Sea by placing sand, like I said, fill the islands to seek control of the area, well, what the US is doing is approaching it differently by presenting that the international law of the sea says so as one to follow, right? It's the rules-based international order. And simply because the US cannot be the aggressor here, it's all up to China to make the first move in terms of the provocation. But trust me, the US can do much more than what's being discussed here. There's so much room for actually to stop China. There's the economic side of things, right? If the war over Taiwan breaks out, the South China Sea becomes a secondary battlefield or battle sea, and the global trade will be affected. the entire area will be under a close watch. And then there's also things like undersea cables where the global internet passes through right beneath the South China Sea. And so China could be cutting them to disrupt connections. There's also valuable information there too. And then there's the weaponization of the islands. While it's hard for the US to take them down, the US can support its allies in other ways. Now it's about ensuring that countries like the Philippines and Vietnam are part of the picture when it comes to discussing the region and the rights to what they have within the region. It's really about arming them and setting up shop here too. The Philippines is especially important for the defense of Taiwan. There's going to be 4 bases where American forces will be stationed at in the Philippines. The Balabac Island in Palawan, Naval Base Camilo Ocias in Santa Ana, Cagayan Province, Lalo Airport in Cagayan, and Cap Machor de la Cruz in Gamu, Isabela. And then there's more recently talks of building up a civilian port in the remote northernmost islands of the Philippines, the Batanes Islands. Of the 4 bases, 3 sit relatively close to Taiwan, but the Batanes Islands are even closer. And this is the northmost point, less than 200 kilometers or about 125 miles from Taiwan. So the US military could elevate the freedom of navigation around Taiwan and the South China Sea and into the Pacific Ocean with the increasing cooperation with the Philippines. So the invasion of Taiwan will make the Philippines a very key player in the regional event, and the Philippines will be the most important country, geostrategically speaking, for the United States to ensure that Taiwan can fend off a blockade. Because where they sit south of Taiwan is something called the Bashi Channel. And this area is going to be so important to prevent for the CCP to block off Taiwan. And so South China Sea is not just an issue that will go away anytime soon. And that's it today for the episode of China Insider. I hope you enjoyed it. If you like it, please leave a like, comment below your thoughts, and subscribe to our channel. All right, until next time. Bye-bye.